Welcome to the Omni Gamers Club podcast, the podcast for games on all platforms, including making the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs. I am Daniel Winter.
And I'm Mark USA, co-hosting this time. But this is our feature episode, and we're going to be talking about one game. But we're not on our own this time, me and Daniel. We're joined by game designer Greg Loring-Albright. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Hello, thanks for having me. I love the show, and it's nice to be on this side.
Yes, thanks for joining us. You and I had the pleasure of playing a game together at PAX recently, so that was great fun. And we're excited to hear about some of the things you've been working on as well. But then we'll all be jumping into talking about Scum and Villainy of our featured game. But first, Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, totally. So as Mark said, I'm Greg Loring-Albright. Yes, we all have our books. Wonderful. So I make games. If you've heard of me at all, which is not likely, but if you have, it's because I made Ahoy, published by Leader Games in 2022. Nick Brockman, who was the lead developer on that game, just finished up an expansion that's coming out soon.
Yeah.
I also co-designed Block by Block, not the original Block by Block, but the most recent edition of Block by Block with T.L. Simons. And I have a game coming out with Central Michigan University Press at the end of January called Keep the Faith. So that's sort of my publication. I also made a micro game about Moby Dick, but I never talk about that because it's 18 cards, but whatever.
Yeah, I'm specifically excited about Keep the Faith, both as a fan of sort of religious studies, I guess, but also as you know, we're all Omni gamers here, but it's sort of bridging something between board games and role playing games as a storytelling experience. So I was hoping you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, totally. I forgot, Daniel, that you're an archaeologist, so that makes sense.
Previously, ex-archaeologist.
Okay. So Keep the Faith is a storytelling game heavily inspired by Fog of Love, if listeners are familiar with that, right? Which is like a board game that functions formally if you just play it, but it's meant to be played with like storytelling and like role-playing elements. And so I love that game. It has its flaws. It's not perfect, but I love it. And Keep the Faith was my attempt to sort of do one of those. I said, this is so cool. Why aren't there more games in this space? Well, I'm a game designer. I'll make one. So it's a game where you create and evolve a religion over 500 fictional years, right? You play 5 rounds. Every round, a century passes. Everyone who was in your stories in round 1 dies. And the people who are sort of following in their footsteps and interpreting their legacies pick up the pieces and keep going. And so it uses board game components to scaffold role-playing for novice and unsure role players. Basically, I play test with a lot of board gamers. I play games with a lot of board gamers, but the RPG scene is so intriguing to me. And I kept trying to put things on the table for people, and they were like, this isn't for me. I don't want to do this. And I was like, I respect the preferences of my players, but I was also like, we're going to do this, and I'm going to figure out a way to make it comfortable. And so by creating this, like, it has a lot of cards, it has some tokens, it feels very board gamey on the table, and it creates these moments where even if you're not sure if you want to talk about religion, or if you're not sure how to improvise a story off the top of your head, like, the game structurally creates space for that.
Yeah, it's one thing I love about the tabletop role-playing space is it's a lot different than it was, 30, 40 years ago.
For sure.
And really, like, the kind of the limits have been broken, and there's a real opportunity for people to it's just kind of an excuse for people to get together, tell stories, and kind of like connect to parts of them that they might not be willing to in almost any other space, certainly outside of therapy or whatever. So I'm really intrigued by what you're describing.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited. It was my back burner project. It was like a game I made just kind of like for me, and I would like play test it with my family and my close friends. And then Liz Davidson, Beyond Solitaire, shout out to Liz, played it with me and was like, you got to show this to Central Michigan. And I was like, why? This isn't for publication. And they like wanted to sign it immediately. So.
Oh, wow. So cool. Yeah, we will definitely want to share more information. We'll do a little reminder for everyone at the end of the show. We'll share some links or wherever. I think you might be doing a Kickstarter in the future. So
I think it's on Backer Kit, but yes, nice. Crowdfunding is happening soon.
Very cool. All right. We'll definitely share some more info about that because I'm intrigued.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
as we'll be discussing later, I am fascinated by storytelling as a concept, but often struggle with that. And board games can provide some more sort of guardrails and guidance to the storytelling experience. So, always excited by more games exploring that sort of sandbox.
Thank you.
Very cool. All right, I think we're going to be tackling a big meaty topic here. So what do you folks think about jumping in there?
Fire up the engines.
Do it.
Yeah.
All right. So Daniel and I will give like just the kind of the top of the box basics, and then we're going to be asking you, Greg, to sort of describe, in a little bit broader terms what the game's about. So of course we're going to be covering a game called Scum and Villainy, an RPG from the publisher is Evil Hat Productions. Daniel, you want to tell us a little bit about the designers?
Yes, so this was designed by Strass Asimovic and John LeBouf Little, based on the previously released game Blades in the Dark, who I think John Harper was the main designer on that. This was published by Evil Hat Productions, but I believe in print, Off Guard Games was those two designers. Released originally on August the 2nd, 2018.
There you go. It's been with us for a few years, and of course, Blades in the Dark, Forged in the Dark, the system has been around a little bit longer than that, and we'll probably talk about some offshoots a bit later. But Greg, do you want to tell us more about Scum and Villainy? What makes it distinct from those other games, or what makes it special to you?
Here's the pitch. This is what sold me on the game, right? Is like I read Blades in the Dark. My university library has a copy. And I loved the mechanical, like just reading it was a pleasure. It sounded really interesting, but the like kind of steampunk, gothic, magotechnic, Dickensian kind of vibe just isn't for me, right? And so I was like, okay, this game's cool, but I'm never going to devote time to playing it. And then I found out about this game, which is like, what if that system, but set in Star Wars,
space.
Firefly, Cowboy Bebop, sort of space hooligans instead of magotechnic criminals. So that's the pit. That's what sold me on this game, right? Is like you get to do the cool Blades in the Dark mechanics, but you get to be in a spaceship and shoot laser guns.
Love it. I'm 100% on the same wavelength there. Because who doesn't like doing those things?
Right? It's a like a near universal appeal. It's like everybody knows what a Han Solo is, and so you're like, do you want to be one of those? Like, yes, totally, cool.
Yeah, the funny little anecdote is I think Daniel and I were interested in covering this game, obviously, and we put a pitch out there to kind of our local Discord group, and we had a session 0, which we'll go into a little bit later. But I think one of the people who attended the session 0, pretty much for the first half or 45 minutes of it, didn't know that we weren't going to be playing a branded Star Wars game. Thought,
funny.
Yeah, but what about the Jedi? We're like, what about the Jedi?
This was a talk we had in my group session 0 as well, of like, okay, there is a sort of fleshed out fiction with names for things in the book, but it's like it would be relatively easy to port this into an existing setting. And so we had that talk too of like, do we want to run this as Star Wars? Do we want to run it as something else? We are running in the sort of like book canon setting. We're just using the setting book, which I think there's strengths and weaknesses too.
Yeah, the setting, the canon of this game is like pretty loose, and that's actually an aspect I like quite a bit about it. Let's ground the audience a little bit and cycle back and maybe talk about like what makes this system unique, maybe from some of the more popular tabletop RPGs that are out there in the world.
I thought perhaps first we should discuss like just what was our experience with it, like set the scene for like what our groups were, how we ran this game.
Awesome. Greg, do you want to start us off? What's your on the ground experience with
Yes, totally. So I am not a very experienced role player, right? As I said earlier, I'm mostly a board game guy. I have played in one D&D campaign, and I've played a bunch of one-shots and weird indie stuff, but like the kind of like descended from D&D lineage where like there's a GM, every player is a single person, you have a character sheet, you're like, that stuff is all very kind of weird to me, which is weird because that's like the norm, right? So I'm GMing for 2 players, which is awesome. I love my small group. We all live with like within an hour of each other by car, but we mostly meet remotely because we all have kids. So our session 0 and sort of like session 1/2 were in person, and then we've mostly done it over Discord since then. We're playing the rebel ship, the Fire Drake. There's sort of like
excellent.
classes you pick to kind of start you off. So, and my players are a speaker, the kind of like social negotiator role, and a scoundrel, the sort of like Han Solo. You're doing a lot of like pushing your luck, trying to roll desperate, trying to see what happens. And then I'm GMing.
Excellent. Yeah, we had a group with 3 players, which I thought was relatively small. So I'm very curious to hear how your experience with just 2 players. So so Mark was our GM, and myself and 2 other players. So we were running the Star Dancer, which I think is the smuggling ship. And it was myself playing a speaker. We had a muscle, I think it was,
Right.
and a doctor.
Yeah, Stitch. That's right. Which is a nice combo. It's sort of like a rock band, right? Obviously,
Right.
you can definitely get by. You can have a 1-man band if you want to, but like you have 3, and you're starting to flesh out the kind of the classic jazz trio, and then quartet, and like the sound sort of gets bigger. So I like that about RPGs.
We did have a couple of other players that originally had signed up. So we originally had 5 players, but only 3 of those were able to sort of lock down when push came to shove, unfortunately. So it would have been fun to see a broader range. It did feel at times like a few of our characters were designed to be support. Like you have a party of 3 support and forget the tank and all the DPS, right? So it's a little bit. It did require some interesting navigation there, which we'll get into, I'm sure. Mark, did you have anything to add as GM of that group?
I will probably add some details in depth, but I'll just say about my background. So I've played 1 session of Blades in the Dark as a player. Our local friend Joe ran that very succinctly, knows the game inside and out. And I sort of felt like you, Greg, is like that world is kind of cool from a like Dishonored the video game kind of vibe, but wasn't exactly for me. Just like kind of evil ghosts and real evil ghosts or whatever taking over bodies, kind of a little bit odd. Definitely the spaciness of this game fit in well for me, and I just kind of channeled my inner Star Wars, Star Trek, Firefly, Stargate loving self, and just kind of enjoyed living in that world. So, and playing with these guys was fun, and I kind of just like read RPG books, so like Powered by the Apocalypse, which is sort of like an underpinning of this system. I understood it fairly well.
You both, or at least Mark is using the past tense. Is your campaign wrapped up? Are you done?
Not exactly. No, we've sort of wrapped up for the holidays, right?
Sure. Okay, makes sense. Yeah. I asked because part of it, I'm sure we'll get there. Part of this system like explicitly says like only play this long, right? Like it's not a forever game. It's not one of these 30-year D&D campaign games.
Designed for about 12 or so sessions, I believe. And it did have an interesting sense of an arc as to how you're supposed to wrap this up. We got about 3 sessions in, or session 0 plus 3 actual missions.
Right.
And I think we all have the interest in continuing. I'm not sure just logistically whether that's likely to happen. We have some other games that we're excited to check out as well. So we'll see in the new year how that comes together.
Cool.
Yeah. RPGs are so interesting. It's like you have so many competing games that are sort of vying for your attention. And also, unlike board games where mostly you could play almost any game with any group, there might be some people grumbling about this genre or that genre. But RPGs, you kind of have to fit the game to the group. They're like the specific subset of people, and you definitely want them coming session after session, as opposed to board game night, which might be a different game every time, different group every time.
And there's another barrier too, right? Which is like the GM, like you said about your friend who ran Blades for you, like the GM really has to know the game inside and out. And so already, my group, we just finished our 6th job, and that's like halfway, right? They're like, wrap it up around 12. And I'm like, okay, if this group wants to hang together, if we get to our 12th and then we're done, am I going to learn a new game? Is someone else going to GM? Are we just going to run another campaign in Scum and Villainy? Because like, I like GMing this game, but it's a lot of work. You have to learn a lot more so than I don't know about, number of rules and formal interactions board game compared to this, but like there's an asymmetry to the work as opposed to in a board game where everyone is sort of doing the rules work together.
There's a lot of work to find out if you even like the game, and then it can take several rounds just to get the grips with it, to sort of train yourself to be good at that game even more so. So yeah, huge investment.
And then you're like, okay, no, it actually was the game. It wasn't that I was bad at running it. I hate this game. I got good at running it, and it's been 3 months. Cool. Bummer.
Yeah, it's true. Well, on the positive side, if you've spent the investment to learn the system, thankfully, Forged in the Dark is popular enough that there are other offshoots and different genres and different settings.
There's at least one other one that's like more of a warfare military sim, I believe, right? I can't remember
I forget what it's called. There's a bunch. Yeah, there's a bunch of Forged in the Dark games.
Band of Brothers, but something like
Band of Blades.
Right. There's Beam Saber, which is also sci-fi, but it's more like basically Gundams and like sci-fi anime. There's one called A State, which is about sort of like, I think, like political upheaval with a bit of sci-fi. Bump in the Dark, which is horror. There's actually so many.
Tell me that political one again. That sounds 100% up my alley.
Yeah, it's called A State, like A/state. So that one is worth checking out. I have a PDF of. But what was I going to say there is like, so yeah, you definitely have the ability to offshoot into other versions of the game because it's just that popular.
Okay, all right. Shall we start getting into it then?
Let's do it.
Let's pick this apart.
Yes.
Finally cycling back.
Shall we start a little bit with the setting, perhaps? And so I think that's going to be pretty brief. There isn't much to talk about here, but just to, again, set the scene as to what this world is taking place in.
Yeah, and also that's an interesting thing. I mean, we're definitely going to be talking about Blades in the Dark because that's the originator. Blades in the Dark is so detailed. It's so detailed. It takes place in ostensibly one city. And basically, detail is written about every single block of the city. Like, like within this 3 buildings, this is this specific district where these specific people hang out and do this sort of stuff. And this game is a little bit less rigidly set up. There's basically 4 large, I guess whether they called sectors or star systems.
Systems, yeah.
Yeah. There's 4 main systems. They're named, and they have basically like one page which defines what the system is all about. So this is one page. You can go download this free kind of downloadable material, and it covers a very simple overview. It's one page. Very simple overview, a description of 3 planets or notable kind of regions. So it might be like a space station, a moon, and a nebula or something like that. And this I really like. It says, here are 3 or 4 notable things about each of this area. And I feel like it's just right. It's like just the right amount of detail that I don't want too much more. Otherwise I have to be like, have this like encyclopedic knowledge of what's going on there, but it just gives just enough hooks to get you to start it. What do you think, Greg?
Yeah, and in the book, there's a little more detail, right? Each planet has a page of its own. But what I like a lot about this sort of hook model is there's characters too, and it's like if you're on this planet, you might meet this guy, and here's 3 words describing them, and you can do what you want. And we had an encounter with one of these people because I needed to throw something at the players. And this guy appeared and did some stuff and disappeared. And I was like, we'll probably never see him again, but I didn't have to make him up, which is a big plus for me as a GM.
It really does feel like a sort of buffet of a lot of shallow hooks. So here's possible things you could dig away at if you want. Some ideas for planets, for names. You say, it is hard to know where to start. You have to have a reference point for like knowing which planet you want to go to in the first place. Having a broad idea of all of your options is tricky without like reading through all 20 planets.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know how it went for you, Greg, but like when I was starting, I know that this game system doesn't exactly want you to set in stone like a plot. Like it's supposed to be more free flowing, like the Powered by the Apocalypse tradition. You're supposed to play to see what happens, right?
Yes, yeah. So and I love that. That to me, that sort of like emergent world building removed a lot of my anxiety as a GM because I'm coming out of board games, right? Initially, like I read this whole book cover to cover. I had players who were interested, and I was like, oh shoot, I don't have to make all this stuff up, and that's like daunting. I know, like hardcore regular GMs are like, what's wrong with you? That's what I like, right? But this was like daunting to me. And then during session 0, during setup, where you create all these hooks of like, okay, your players individually have friends and enemies who might be affiliated with factions. Your ship has enmities and friendlinesses with factions. And so I drew like a whole like map of like, okay, here's who we're friends with and who we're enemies with, and here's who they're friends with and who they're enemies with. And then those places, those groups also have places affiliated with them. So by the time we were done session 0, I was like, okay, great. There's like stuff to grab onto. If we go to this planet, who's there? Our best friend. Cool. They're going to give us some money and a place to hang out. If we go here, that's our enemy's territory. Like this, I loved it that it's not a canonical narrative setting, right? There are little bits of narrative that crop up and kind of help make all these things mean something. But it's like you kind of slot all these mechanical things into place. And it's like, okay, obviously the story is about this, right? My group were a group of rebels on a spaceship. And the first kind of half of our arc was like, what's our deal? Who are we going to join up with? There were some competing rebel factions that I made up and sort of added into the fiction. And then the evil military, the oppressive government military is always after us. And then we have a twist where the spy agency, who's kind of like trying to topple the government of the sector. Canonically in the book, this is like their goal. And so they're always showing up and like either helping us out at the last minute because we're, aligned with them temporarily, or telling us like, stop doing this. This is against our plan, right? And so all of this just arose from the setting book and from a few like +1, -1 with each faction. And that was awesome. I was very happy about that.
Yeah, I love that about these books and the factions. So we haven't touched upon the factions yet, but there's about 20 or so
25, yeah.
factions. Yeah. And they are maybe like the breathing heart of this game world anyways. So we said that there's only 4 systems, but there's like 20 or so factions, and they're written in such a way their descriptions are not that deep either, maybe like half a page each. But they're written in such a way that they also have notable NPCs, notable qualities about them, like their headquarters is this roving giant spaceship or something like that, or they're headquartered in this nebula. And they also have allies and enemies. So that sort of like chart you described, Greg, of alliances and enmities is sort of like baked into the core of the game. And that might create a challenge from a novice GM and being like, whoa, that's so big, that's so internecine. How do I navigate that space? Well, really, you don't really need to navigate the whole map. You just need to figure out what your corner of that map is.
Ideally, you pick like 3 or 4 factions to zero in on, right? Or each character might have 1 or 2 that they're interested in or associated with. But yeah, it was fascinating. I don't think we really dove into that too much in our session, in our campaign. But you're supposed to be tracking these factions, even if you're not directly interacting with them. They have their own goals that they're working on in the background behind the scenes and working towards that. And so it does make this world feel quite alive as a sandbox. Other things that's happening around you.
Yeah, it's basically Fallout New Vegas, right? It's like you're working for these guys, but you're pissing off these guys. Better watch out for that. No, I think that's very
rolling
strong.
For faction progress between sessions is like my second favorite part. My favorite part is hanging out with my players and doing the gameplay. But when it's over and I'm like taking notes and like codifying everything into our shared Google Drive, there's a moment where I'm like, oh yes, now I get to roll dice for each faction and see what they're doing. And if they complete a goal, right, I have to decide as the GM, like, is this actually happening now in the narrative? In which case it's going to push stuff up to the top for the player characters. Do I kind of like cheat a little bit and hold it and be like, this one's going to fire off in the middle of next session if we need it? Or do I say, okay, they've done that thing, it doesn't impact the player story, now I'm going to give them a new goal to start rolling on, and maybe by the time they complete that, it will impact the player story. And so that's like a moment of play that I get to have just like by myself when I'm processing the game, and it's so much fun.
Yeah, I was really looking forward to seeing those factions fire off. I don't think we really saw much of that, Mark. Perhaps you can speak to some of the difficulties in sort of bringing that into the game.
Yeah, I definitely, when I was planning it out, I did just what we were describing. I picked 2 or 3 main factions that I knew were going to be sort of the players for the early part of the scene. And like, I didn't codify things too tightly because I wanted the players to sort of choose for themselves where they wanted to go. So definitely they've encountered like 1 or 2 factions a lot just because they're building up, enmity with one particular one and they're sort of being chased by another. But I've laid down like the hooks beneath the plot, but I don't really think the players have encountered them yet, just because they've been so focused on one. So I'm ready to spring the trap. Essentially, they don't know that they're ready to go, but yeah, I guess that's like leads into this is maybe a bit of a tangent, but like my challenge with GMing this game is like how much do I follow the systems as they're written, or how much do I follow the narrative and the plot where I feel like it's going?
Yes, this is a tension I also feel in my GMing. I wanted to ask, like, because this is something I encountered, and I think I was doing wrong for my group, maybe not necessarily rules wrong in the beginning that my group and I are sort of navigating now. It's like, how did you present jobs to your players? Or I guess Daniel, how were jobs presented to you?
Yeah, I mean, so we had our first mission, which felt like very much a standard job. There's a thing you need to get from this place. Go to the place, get the thing. How are we going to insert ourselves into this location? It was stealing a MacGuffin from some space pirates, right?
And Mark said, "Here's what you're doing because it's session 1. You're just going to do it."
Things roll out from there. We had some interesting like factional outcomes from that. Like we really pissing off one or two guys. Like this head of the faction will remember that. So write down the name of this guy. That's a hook that we can bring in later in the campaign. And from there things cascaded a little bit in terms of, well, the drop off went bad, and so we're sort of trying to escape, and there was sort of this rolling ball of sort of cause and effect events that were never allowed for the very episodic structure that this game really wants. I think it does. The game is built around episodes of, here's a job, you complete the job, here's the downtime. Okay, what's the next job? Whereas I think our structure fell into a little more of the traditional just events cascading into each other. Perhaps you can speak to some of how that came to be. I think, but we didn't really have an explicit job for a couple of our later sessions.
Yeah, I'll just say that this is after the fact, so it probably won't affect you too much, Daniel. But the first job we did, basically, those members we talked about couldn't make it for the first session. So I thought, oh, this is just going to be a session 0.5. So I'll just basically the game was supposed to start in media res, like they were dropping off the MacGuffin, and then that's where the story starts.
Got it.
So I just went back a bit and been like, okay, you guys have to get the MacGuffin. So that was pretty easy to do, and it was maybe the most ideal form.
And that's what the game wants to be, is just the job itself rather than the follow through necessarily, I think.
Right, but the challenge I had is that you're right, Daniel. This game expects it to be like heist of the week, job of the week sort of series, kind of like not really exactly like Star Trek: The Next Generation, but more like, I don't know, the A-Team or something like that, right?
Firefly.
Yeah, you roll into town, this scenario happens, you wrap it up, and then there's some downtime. But the kind of stories I find more interesting are like, Deep Space Nine or Battlestar Galactica, where there's like this overarching plot and that things are kind of more blurry, where,
and it's clear that the game finds that interesting too, right? It's like if it was like the game is mechanically built for job downtime, and Mark was just like, I just like running it story wise, I'd be like, okay, but you're kind of playing against the game. But the game has that tension built into itself. I feel that too, of like, yes, in a session when my players and I meet up, it's like, what job are we doing? What approach are we picking? It's all these very mechanical, like,
yes,
these things don't fire unless you say we are doing a job now.
Right.
And if you don't say we're doing a job now, you're in free play, which is fine and cool. But there's a lot of cool mechanical effects that only key off of being in a job.
Yeah.
And so I kind of expected the game to be more sequential, like you're saying. But this
here's a little
is all
sequence.
There you go.
This is a little flow chart, which is from this is supposed to be a cheat sheet of the structure of a flow chart. But it brings up the question: what is a job? When does it start?
Yes.
When does it end? It's not so cut and dry as the book might lead you to believe.
That's one of the real friction points, I think, was we only had one downtime sort of segment in those 3 missions that we did, there wasn't really a clear sense of when was a good downtime to be. Like, if we're not at our ship, there's not really a clear spot to sort of to retreat and have that sort of decompression zone. That we were just constantly stuck in one sequence of action to the next. And I think perhaps part of that is we got stuck in the weeds a little bit in some of the action, and we can talk about why that might have happened a little later. But just the structurally, the game is very loose in terms of when one bit of action ends and the next begins, right? So I think I was reading through some of the GM notes, and it does suggest you can skip over wide swaths of action just to get to the key moments. But you really have to know when to do that, when to keep the action moving, and skip over the sort of the filler, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, Greg, how often did you do like downtime? Like, was it alternating every session?
We're pretty and we're playing pretty fast. Like my group, we meet for 2 hours. We have like a hard in when like dinner ends, and a hard out when people have to go to put their kids down. And so we're like moving pretty fast. And so the game encourages you to skip to the action is great for me as the GM, because it's not like, okay, we're having this leisurely afternoon, let's like dig into the gunfight. It's like roll scrap, that's the gunfight, next thing. But we usually try and do downtime in the same session. So I'll try and run a job in like an hour and a half, and then a downtime in half an hour. That's happened maybe like 4 of the 6 jobs we've run. Yeah.
That's really cool. You're way more focused and efficient than our group is.
We have to be, because we all have small children, and we all like can't fit anything in our schedules otherwise.
You can probably hear the events, the after effects of my child running around right now, and it's the having to record in the middle of the day.
Yep.
That's really smart. Your group is a lot more efficient that way. So formally, let me just clarify, because I don't think we really explained it, but the book says that most of the game by default is played in this sort of 3-part structure. Most of the game is free play, and then the job phase begins, which is, the kind of the heist, the job, the steal, the get the bad guy, whatever. And then there's a separate formal downtime phase, and then there's sort of a sequence of steps you follow to sort of achieve downtime, like relieving stress through vices or things like that. So it's quite structured.
And it's mechanically very important. It's not like you can just skip downtime, because the sort of rhythms of the player sheet are designed to be like, well, you've built up a lot of stress and you're going to take a trauma, and if you take too many trauma, you die.
Yeah, that build up and release is really key to the tempo. And like I said, I think we struggled with finding that release sometimes, which had some sort of cascading effects. So I think perhaps we could zero in on some of that structure of the job and how that plays out. Do we want to start first on like just pull back a little bit to the character and ship creation?
Sure. So one thing that this game, or Forged in the Dark games, carry over from Powered by the Apocalypse is the playbooks. So some games like I guess like Shadowrun, like D&D, have classes, and they're sort of like rough archetypes for types of characters. Some games don't have classes, by the way, which is totally cool too. They're just more of a mixture, a melange. Games like City of Mist are like that. You just kind of mix these Lego parts together. And this game explicitly has playbooks. So they're sort of like a defined sheet, usually on one sheet. And they're usually meant to be like, hey, pass these around in your group in session 0 and just kind of peg which one you like, and then fill in a couple of check boxes and you're off and running. Actually, Daniel, I'll ask you, because you're the person who's been the player,
token player here,
most actively. How did you feel about the playbooks compared to other role-playing games you played?
I found the terminology playbook quite confusing just reading through the book, because I hadn't really come across that yet. In terms of defining it, it's kind of the same thing as a class. I struggled with finding the distinction, and some of the terminology I found in the rule book a little confusing. But I did find it fairly simple in just creating a character, in how much of it was basically kind of like a checklist. Like you don't have to create, like a lot of it is in picking things off a buffet menu. Like, which is your background? Here's 5 options. Which is your heritage? Here's 5 options. Here's 4 named characters which of these are you friends with, which of these is a rival potentially. And so it's very, very loose, but you can tick those off without thinking too deeply, and let the actual implications of those things come out as part of the game. You don't have to plan your character too deeply before you start rolling.
Yeah,
did you like
I like
that?
Oh, sorry. I like it. Spoilers.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I struggle with actually internalizing a full, fleshed out character to start the game rolling with. And I certainly had ideas, not all of which come out to play. Sometimes you just have to let the game. The character has a life of their own in a sense with the way the fiction is built, and just let the events build the character as you go, which I did appreciate. And same as the GM can't have a specific adventure in mind, the characters can't necessarily railroad how their character is going to play out.
Cool. Greg?
Yeah, that's all I was going to say. That I love that, like, you set it up, and the book, even like the sheets are pretty static. Like, you get to make a few choices, but it's like, you're really good at this, you're good at these two things, you have, a skill checked already, and it's like, pick another one. And then in the book, it goes even deeper, and it says, if you don't make any choices, here's a couple pre-builds of like, okay, you're picking the pilot archetype. Do you want to be like the hotshot racer pilot or like the ex-military pilot? And they just be like, check this, check this, check this, check that. And I ran a one-shot of this for some colleagues, and I used that to good effect, right? I didn't have to teach them, like, what does it mean that you will get extra loadout during the job? I was like, who do you want to be? Be them. I'll tell you what it means when we get there. And that was very cool.
Yeah, there's so many cases in this game where you could just say, okay, what type of hotshot pilot do you be? You want to be Han Solo? Do you want to be like Wash? Or do you want to be like Tom Paris? It's just different flavors, different slices of these archetypes, and you can pull from so many like media examples of each of those. So I think that's a good, strong way to lead newbie players in. For sure.
And curiously, from there, as a group, you're then choosing a ship. There's 3 options of ship to choose from, which very much feel like each one is forcing the game into a particular archetype. You've got the Star Dancer that we were playing, a smuggler ship, which feels basically Firefly. You have the what was the one that you were playing, Greg?
We're playing the Fire Drake, which is like
very much
a Corvette,
Star Wars,
like a military. Yeah.
And then there's another one that's the Bounty Hunter, which I think is modeled on Cowboy Bebop,
or like the Slave one from from Boba Fett, obviously.
Yeah,
it looks like a Cowboy Bebop ship though. The drawing of that is like, yeah, this is just Cowboy Bebop straight up.
It is very much weighing the scales in terms of what flavor of sci-fi do you want, but then also tying that to what types of jobs you can take. I think there is some wiggle room in choosing one type of ship and doing different jobs, but it is kind of railroading you in a sense to like pick the Firefly ship, do some smuggling jobs.
Yeah, the ship types are interesting because they're almost kind of like the series concept. If we consider that everyone's Scum and Villainy game is like a sci-fi TV series, it's like if you choose the ship, you choose the type of show you're watching, the type of game you're playing.
Yeah, and there are rules for like switching out. Somewhere in the book, it's like, if you get a couple sessions in and you don't like the kind of jobs you're doing, switch your ship, right? It's not like talk to your GM about how to do other jobs. It's like, no, you've picked the wrong track.
That is very strange considering how much granularity there is in upgrading the ship. There are a lot of, there's like 5 different systems to upgrade and a bunch of unique modules. And I find that very confusing, even just to set up in the first place. Like, I think you start out, you have like, you can choose 2 upgrades, but choosing between like the system attribute upgrades versus the unique things of like, we have the long range scanners, or we have the hyperlane maps, and there was some inconsistency or just confusion in the language there as to how you were supposed to build the ship, I think.
Yeah. And I think this maybe is an artifact of Blades in the Dark, right? Where in Blades in the Dark, what you're upgrading is not your ship, it's your hideout. It's like a building where you like hang out and live and do stuff. And I don't know, to me, like, I've been in buildings, right? I've not been in spaceships. And so to me, this granularity makes a little more sense when I see this as an artifact of Blades.
We've spent very little time in our ship.
Yeah.
I had to send my players like a 3-paragraph email about how the ship upgrade system works because we were doing it async. And I was like, I'm very annoyed right now.
Yeah, Greg, you make a good point about Blades. Like it's yes, it is the hangout, but it's also kind of like your gang. Is like your gang too, like as in like you can expand your turf. take over more blocks of this fictional town that
These
you
are all
exist in.
like system, like game mechanic terms in Blades, by the way. Mark isn't just making up gangs and terms. This is like capitalized G in the rulebook, gang.
Right, and like that in Scum and Villainy, your ship is not just your ship, but it's also your crew.
Right.
Some of the upgrades are sort of tied into that.
Like your reputation level, overall reputation, and what's
your gambits,
tier level or something? Yeah.
You're definitely your crew quality, I think it's called.
Right, quality, yes.
Which basically equivalent is the equivalent of your tier, and all these. There's a lot of terms in this game.
I wanted to ask, just because I'm curious, what is your ship's reputation?
I think we ended up with Reckless pretty much out of the gate and really struggled to rein it in away from that. It wasn't what I initially had in mind, but again, that's how the dice rolled.
No, well, you kind of have to roll with how the group the group functions, right? Maybe not your ideals, but how it actually functions in the world.
Yes, totally.
If you have one Reckless player, that's kind of going to cascade things for everyone else.
Totally.
Yeah, how about your group, Greg?
The players started and they picked meh, like MEH, like mediocre, because they were sort of like, their characters were kind of like trying to find their way in to the rebellion. And that was tough because you get rewarded for doing things in your fashion, your reputation. So pretty quickly they switched to messy, which feels like reckless, right?
Nice.
If there's a choice to blow something up or not, they're going to blow it up so they get the messy XP.
I did see a rule. I was reading through the GM guide, the chapter earlier. I did see there's a rule that when in doubt, make explosions happen.
Yes.
Yeah, you got to think cinematic, right? It's just like you're not tuning in to see a meh crew do meh actions.
Yeah,
or
and so like
jobs.
my players are wonderful, and we are very collaborative as a table about like I regularly kind of drop the GM screen. I'm like, what do we want to do here? And so we were sort of able to loop that into the narrative, sort of the broader arc of like the season of like, okay, they've come into their own. They're learning how to do things better, but not great. And so they've gone from meh to messy.
Nice. Don't you like a lot of these stories have the sort of, like the farm boy from the sticks falling into a scenario and they're over their head, and then by the end of the movie they're doing dogfights in this gigantic planet killing space station. So like I think that's supposed to happen, right? You're supposed to go for a ride. It's just like kind of what ride will that game take place?
Well, speaking of moving the action forward, shall we roll into a little bit about the actual job structure, and that can lead into some of the sort of the actual moment-to-moment gameplay.
Sure.
So I guess you mentioned previously that you have the jobs and the downtime tempo, and I think there is a plan here in terms of the jobs. It's very little sense that the GM is planning these jobs in advance. I mean, you can basically just roll them on a table, I believe. Or pull in some of the factions that you want to engage with. But ultimately, you have a job which might be a smuggling, might be bounty, it might be I don't know what the rebellion thing. Oh, like taking out
it's like raiding supply depots, breaking blockades, occasionally like assassinating a general or something.
It's kind of like Andor, right? It's like what's the crew going to do this time?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have a loose goal there, I guess. You pick how are you going to approach this mission? Like, do you want to go in guns blazing? Do you want to go with some deception? And I think, Mark, there's an engagement role that the GM does at the start, which kind of guides the starting position, which is like the how screwed are you? How much are the tables against you as you enter into this scenario?
Yeah, you're exactly right, and this is what this flowchart is, by the way, of setting up the job. This one sheet is just about the job, and those approaches you take you pointed out are very important: assault, deception, infiltration, mystic, social, transport. So those are mostly pulled straight from Blades in the Dark. They also had those approaches to the job too.
And that is quite granular in having to choose a specific option, and I don't know. I don't have an explicit feeling for how each of those affects the course of the game, because it's not like it's forcing you to play a particular way.
Yeah, I don't know how you feel, Greg, but to me it feels like it's a compromise, not in a bad way. It's sort of like if you come from sort of heist job type games like Shadowrun, that's my earliest experience in TTRPGs. You can spend so long planning the job planning for things that will never happen because you just don't know. This is actually quite narrow when you think about it. It's like narrowing it down from everything that could happen into 6 different approaches to basically roughly what will happen. I think just moves the action along in a fairly
because
efficient
the
way.
game wants you, like it explicitly tells the GM when you start a job, don't start at the beginning of the job, right? Start at the most, like the first interesting moment of the job. And so I think for me as a GM, the approach that the players choose helps me get some stuff. If the engagement roll goes well, what is that? That's going to mean something different for an assault mission versus a deception mission. And so, or if it goes poorly, same deal, right? It's like, oh no, you are closer to being found out, or all your guns jammed, right? And the other thing that the approach does is it asks the players a question, which is like supply the detail, right? It's like, okay, if you're doing infiltration, right? It's like, how do you get in, right? So my players were raiding a base, and one of them had a broken leg, and they're like, well, we can't raid the base with a broken leg, so that player's character was like hacker Overwatch, and the other player then went in physically while she was like typing and opening doors and stuff. And so already, like, now I have so much fiction to go on from infiltration. There's going to be some hacking. I roll an approach to see, okay, how many guards are in there, how many defenses have they tripped, etc. And so that, coupled with the flashback system, which I know we'll get to, I think gets to the formal qualities of like a heist movie really nicely.
Yeah, so it really just sets the tone rather than shifts the game in any mechanically, but just gets everyone on the same page and sort of helps clarify the tone and what you're all aiming for together. Both so the GM can plan accordingly, but also the players can have some sort of collaboration there. But I think that really does lead into like probably my favorite part of this game is you mentioned the flashbacks there, but also the loadouts,
Right.
and that this really does a game that wants you to feel like the sense of having a well-planned heist without having to do all that planning in advance. So the loadout system, basically, you choose, I think it's like light, normal, or heavy, which is how many items you can bring with you into that mission. Crucially, you don't have to pick the explicit items before you actually start the mission. Like you have a list of, here's the 20 things I can potentially pull from. And if you say you have a normal loadout, you can choose 6, but you don't actually have to tick off any of those items until you explicitly pull the gun out of your pocket and shoot, right? Or the scanner, or the what other items do you have?
My speaker
tools.
has fancy gifts, right? So if she's gonna bribe someone, she can be like, and here's a beautiful bottle of brandy.
Yes, I had a case of wine that I was constantly carrying around. Yeah, so that is really, gives you some flexibility, but and you can I just had the perfect item at the perfect time. Here you go. And keyed in specifically with the flashbacks, which is where at any time, I think there's a slight there is a downside. You have to take some stress, I believe.
That's right.
But you can basically, if something's going bad, you can say, "Oh, I actually set this up in advance. I already spoke to I had an insider friend who left the key card under the mat, or I had the perfect pheromone to cancel out this this alien creature."
There's actually a scale where it says if it's something that would logically and narratively have happened, it doesn't cost any stress. And if it's like a mild sort of interjection, it costs 1 stress. And if it's like a bigger, like multi-stage setup thing, it costs 2 stress. And stress sort of becomes like the currency with which the players sort of achieve more, do more exceptional things. And it adds a great deal of tension to the gameplay and gives the players a lot of choice and agency. And it's sort of like the secret sauce, I think, of Forged in the Dark games. I like it a lot.
To me, I couldn't help but think of, there's a scene in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure where they're like, well, we don't have time to steal the key now. So when we've already saved the day, we'll go back in time and steal the key and then leave it under this doormat here. And then there's the key. We've set it like retroactively creating these little time loops for yourself. So that's a lot of fun to keep the action going and sort of feeling clever without actually having to plan it in advance.
Yeah, it's so good. It's just like you don't. My first couple sessions, we started to kind of get bogged down in like, well, where are we going to park the ship when we go into the fancy? It's like, no. We're in the fancy club. when it matters, we'll figure out where we park the ship, and that'll be good or bad for you depending on how you roll.
I do think we struggled a little bit with with utilizing those tools to the full effect, and perhaps again getting a little bogged down in the action when we could have been using flashbacks more effectively potentially. So it does take some work to use them. I think. Did you have anything to add to that, Mark, before we move along?
Yeah, I think it really depends on player style, especially if you're not. Maybe you're even. It's easier to introduce novice RPG players to this sort of model because you don't have pre-existing conceptions about how TTRPGs should play. I think that our group it was a new group for one. We didn't know each other, most of us.
Yeah.
We haven't played this particular game with each other, but we had all played other games in the past. And even, myself included, I'll freely admit it, was relying on a lot of on the scene player development. I don't think we cut right to the action as much as we could have. And because the players were coming from different places, I wanted to give each character a sort of a moment to shine or build up their backstory a little bit. And maybe this type of game doesn't really demand or encourage that. Maybe it does in downtime.
It's so tough because I feel this too as the GM, and I only have 2 players to manage. It's like I want to make sure that they're getting roughly equal time. They're taking 2 hours out of a weeknight to hang out. And thankfully, we're all friends and we can kind of talk about that at the meta level. But yeah, the game, there are moments where it's like, this character is just on a spree. We just need to follow them for a little while. And the other characters are just going to kind of have to chill a little bit. And it's hard to navigate that as the GM.
I personally, my character felt like I wanted to take a backseat sometimes because there's only 3 of us. That's where I really felt like more players would allow that sort of push and pull to the more dynamic spotlights to move around. I think one of the hardest things about this game is that there is no turn structure. There's no in combat, out of combat. It's just like once you're in the mission, there's just this free form play. Like, how is this going to go? And which is incredibly flexible, but does require a lot of work to sort of mold it to how you want. And again, giving everyone equal playtime, or sometimes I felt like it was too much pressure on me sometimes. Like I want someone else to take the reins a little bit. So that can be a little tricky to navigate.
Yeah, it really depends on the group, sort of the trust level and understanding of each other. Easier to do potentially in a smaller group, which it sounds like we had. It was a little bit harder with ours because I thought there was a little bit of fighting with like direction and a little bit more of a tug, but that's going to be dependent on each individual group. But yeah, this game has a very different flow than a lot of traditional RPGs.
Yeah, it's you have to like untrain your sense of narrative, or like we always in my group are always kind of zooming out to the meta. It's like, okay, right, we're this episode of our show is the like 80s action movie Assault on the Base, and where are we in that narrative structure? Okay, so then we'll flash back to this, and then we get back into it. But yeah, it's like if you're just playing it like D&D style, where you're just kind of like 6 seconds, 6 seconds, 6 seconds. It's not built for that, and it's hard to do that.
Well, what you're describing, Greg, actually sounds really cool. I wish our group did a little bit more, is like the collaborative storytelling. This game, it does have a lot of stuff for the GM to do, a lot of responsibility for the GM to do, but it also does encourage the players to interject a decent bit in the storytelling as well. I think they even codify like, which of these 6 things does the GM do? Which of them do the players do? And I think the most cohesive, the most successful probably sessions of Forged in the Dark, Scum and Villainy, is going to be when everyone sort of takes an equal sort of responsibility towards telling the story, moving the story forward, sort of focusing on what's important and what's fun and what's cool.
Yeah, and you talked about like experienced players. Like both of my players are game designers and like are deeper in the indie RPG scene than me. And a lot of indie games, at least right now in the moment, are all about that sort of like, we all zoom out, we all talk about our expectations, and then we play them out. And so they are both better at that than I am. And so it's a joy to GM them because they kind of take part of my work from me, which is awesome.
I mean, personally, I would say part of the struggle in navigating that was just that it is a very fiction-forward game, but with this, the granularity of the rules, I think collectively as players, we all forgot a lot of rules and what those tools were to navigate those mechanics. Like, we forgot the flashbacks a lot of the time, we forgot resistance rolls a lot of the time. There were a lot more tools we could have pulled on. But we felt the constraints of the mechanics more than the flexibility of the mechanics. And I think it is a lot to take in, I will say. Perhaps we can roll into a little bit the actual, like, the action roles and like the actual mechanics of how those play out.
Sure. I think we could do this part pretty quick because it's sort of like down to the numbers. And I would like to kind of jump into like the sort of specific maybe like nitpicks of the system and also what's really great about the system too. I guess I'll lead into the mechanics just because they're kind of fresh on my mind. This is powered by the apocalypse based, so roughly on a roll of a single die, you only need to roll a single die, or sometimes there's variation. You have a 50-50 chance of success. You on a roll of 1 to 3, it's fail. 4 to 5, it's a partial success. Partial is very important and happens a lot. And then only on a roll of a 6 on a 6-sided die is it an unmitigated success. And you are able to get a critical success if you roll 2 6s or more. So unlike powered by the apocalypse, you don't add the values of the dice together plus an attribute or a skill. You actually just get more dice to roll. And you can do actions without any skill or training. You just roll 2 d6s and you take the lower of the two values. So that's basically the dice mechanism.
Yeah, what I wanted to get at there was more talking through about what success and failure means for this game.
Right.
It is, I mean, it is a very binary system in terms of success or failure, or maybe a little bit of both. But there is a lot of flexibility in how you define success or failure. It feels very qualitative rather than quantitative. I mean, it's not like you're going up against an enemy who has 10 HP and 3 armor resistance, for example, right? Like, you roll a scrap check against a guard to try and punch them, and it's a success with mitigating complications. Yeah. What does that mean? Like, there's so many ways of interpreting that which is a lot of freedom, but also quite intimidating at times.
Well, I was just going to ask Greg. You said you are mostly a novice to TTRPGs. You haven't extensively played some of the other systems that are maybe more famous.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to see your perspective on this because, I have a lot of the players out there have, and it's just like a different flow, a different setup, a different structure, and there's so many like kind of what is it, like angles to an action roll. There's sort of planning you have to do before, choices that players have and GM have to make during, even in the middle of the roll, and then how to interpret the results after the roll. So I'm just going to mention the 3 main criteria, and then you guys can talk about how you feel about them. There's what is it? There's the position of the roll. That's very unique to Forged in the Dark games. It's either, what is it? Controlled, risky is the default, or desperate is the sort of the hardest, most I guess impactful thing. And then so there's the position, and then there's the effect of the roll. This is really interesting, I thought. You have to decide what the effect is going to be before you make the roll. Or like the GM has to decide that. That's kind of like, I don't know if I like that. Because it's sort of like neuters the action, takes that away from the player.
And furthermore, that effect is broken down into like 3 subcategories of, is it potency, tier, and quality? Scale? There's like 3 subcategories.
Quality/tier, which are kind of the same, and scale.
Yeah, which are all like 3 different, like, it's very qualitative, but it's this really odd mix of number crunching versus sort of qualitative descriptions, right? And it's hard to zero in on how to measure those things in the moment. Like, you can't plan this in advance. There's no clear sense of how strong is this particular enemy against your characters.
And then even during the roll, the player, before they've rolled any dice, they have to determine, am I going to push myself? Am I going to take a devil's bargain? I'm going to do a flashback. I'm going to use a gambit. Am I going to get assistance? Like there's so many like levers that you can have to push or pull on. I feel like it's kind of like a game of Netrunner that you have to play for each and every action. Anyways, I've talked a lot.
I love
Greg,
Netrunner.
I'm
Greg, what do you
curious
think?
though, as I figured that there's potential here for disagreements between the GM and the players. Like, well, this is clearly a desperate role. No, there's nothing desperate about this. It's a controlled role, or this arguing the tier or scale of particular enemies. Like, did your players push against that at all?
Yeah, so they will mostly argue when they argue for more dice, which is like kind of the mechanical base of it, right? And it's like, yeah, all the sort of like, oh, is it great effect or standard effect? We play pretty fast and loose with those rules. There are many times where I will forget to say, like, I'm pretty good at saying, like, okay, this is a risky standard, right? That's like the basic. You just, if someone's going to roll dice, you just, as a GM, you just, the book says, just say risky standard and think about it later. But yeah, like figuring out what that actually means is much more negotiable after the fact. And I think that's like how it's supposed to work, I think. Like, thinking as Mark sort of broke down all the steps of like, yeah, here are all the things you can think about when you do a roll. It's like, yeah, the game stalls a little bit.
Yeah.
When the GM calls for a roll. And it's like, okay, we have to figure out a lot of things. And I think it's part of our sort of thing we've been talking about in this chat, which is like the weirdness of the tempo of the game. Because then you kind of like get to 0. And then you get to describe a bunch of stuff, right? But it's different from D&D, where it's like, you hit his armor with a sword. You hit his head. It's like,
very clear cause and effects.
Stop playing, do mechanics, and then describe punch, pow, hit, have, and then it happens, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I forget what question you asked me, but yeah, it's like it's funky. It's taken me some work to figure out as GM, even not being well versed in GMing D&D or more sort of standard non-Forged in the Dark role playing games.
Yeah, because the struggle as a player was that you by default at low level starting out character, you have like 1 or 2 dice on each roll, and it's very hard to feel. This is no power fantasy. You're very underpowered,
right.
and it was constantly a struggle to get more than 1 dice on a particular roll. Like, I'm already capped out my stress because we haven't had a downtime in 2 sessions. We've run out of gambits. Well, I can try and negotiate a devil's bargain, but that requires more sort of negotiation and back and forth, and it's dragging things out. So even just having to negotiate for each individual dice just feels like dragging things out when I'm trying to push the action forward. But then that just means I'm rolling 1 dice and failing, which is also dragging things out more. So I think we sort of got trapped a couple of times in action, just not getting stuck in a rut and not being able to push forward.
I do like a tool that the game gives GMs that I have found myself using is escalation, right? If you start the roll at controlled and they fail, it's not one of the options for the player is try something different, right? But then they have to like, oh, what am I going to do? They have to think about it.
Yeah.
One of the things it says the GM can do is escalate, right? Like, okay, you punched and you missed. Now you're going to punch again, but now he's ready for you, right? And now it's risky. And so you can go from controlled to risky to standard and give your players a chance to succeed with just greater and greater consequences if they keep failing.
Yeah, I think that was the real sticking point for me, was the success with complications. I think we defaulted way too much to try something different. It's like, well, you shoot the guard or you punch the guard and it hits, but it doesn't take him out. He's still coming at you. It's like, okay, well, now I've got to think of a different thing to do, and I'm all out of ideas, right? I struggle personally thinking on the fly, so I struggle with that and trying to think more creatively about some of the other complications that you might come up with that help push things forward.
Yeah, one of the players in our group, after 2 or 3 sessions, like, they were a very like narrative focused player. They're thinking about character motivations and sort of drama and things like that, and they were finding it quite frustrating that the game doesn't really give you a lot of unmitigated success, right?
Right.
It's like a ton of mixed success. So good with the bad. And he felt like quite frustrated. I think he brought it up at the end. It's like, when am I going to get to have a success in this? And, like I had to like come to terms with like how I was running the game is like, well, you do succeed, but this other thing happens too. And I don't know, this game system, the way the rules are set up for success test is like, I feel like the pushing and pulling on the scale of the effect and the force of the effect and changing the position of the rolls, like I would have made those choices anyway. I would have decided what the outcome of the game was going to be anyway, but I just felt like more constrained by the procedural steps that I had to follow.
Yeah, something I like that I have, I think this is in the book, I don't know. We are very, in my group, we are very aggressive, or I guess thoughtful about, before we roll, the player says, here's what'll happen if I succeed. Right?
Cool.
And so then, even if it's a complicated success, I have to say, yes, that thing happened. So then they feel good. But I don't know.
Yeah. Because again, one of the key sticking points was like, you say you're fighting 3 enemies. There's 3 guards, 3 space pirates. Like, what does this success mean? Killing one of them or taking them out of the action completely? Like,
right. And the player, I think, as a player, you're supposed to say, I'm going to shoot my gun 3 times and kill them all stone cold dead.
Yeah.
And then you roll. You're like, okay, I did it.
Which feels almost too powerful. So I think we're sort of almost neutering ourselves in our effects sometimes. And again, getting stuck in those weeds. You really have to train yourself and push yourself to be clear about cause and effect in this game, which takes some work.
Other games like D&D have very like spelled out, excuse the pun, descriptions of what the effects are going to be. It's like you did 4 damage, or you apply this sort of effect on this character for 3 turns. Or something like that. Even other Powered by the Apocalypse games, like obviously Apocalypse World or City of Mist, which I have the most direct experience with, it says like, on this specific result, gain 2 +1s towards asking questions, or get like 3 clues, or this person has a -2 for 3 rounds, or something like that. It has a very, very clear outcome. And I feel like this game kind of doesn't. It's sort of like muddy, a lot of muddiness in
or
what
it
the
makes you
results
say
could
the
be.
outcome first, which feels narratively very weird, because it's like it's kind of a weird mirror of the flashback mechanic, where it's like the player says, I'm gonna do this thing, and then the GM says, how much am I going to challenge you? The player says, I want to get all the money and win the game. And the GM says, okay, that's going to be a super hard roll. Like that's
pretty desperate.
That's kind of what it wants you to do. And in fact, in the book, there's stuff about like you can set a 0 effect. You can say, you can make this roll, and if you succeed, it will have no effect, right? Which is so counterintuitive and strange.
Like,
but it wants you to bid into buffing the effect.
To your point, doesn't the GM also have a card that they can pull that just neuters it by just controlling what the effect of any given action is going to be? Is like, the player can argue for what the outcome is going to be, but if the GM turns the dial down on the effect to 0, it's just totally neutering the action that they did to begin with, which brings me to my other point, is resistance. Essentially, at any given point, the player can once again, oh no, I'm flipping the table once again on you, GM. I can nope anything that you throw, any consequence that you throw at me, by doing this, albeit kind of mechanically cool, resistance roll, where you get to roll against your attribute total. It's a bit of math there, but you bring the effect, like -6 stress down to potentially 0 stress, and you feel like a god when you pull that off.
It's the hero is falling out of the hotel after the heist, and then they end up in a dumpster and they don't get hurt.
Daniel, as a player, what do you feel about resistance rolls?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we forgot about it completely for the first session, and knowing that's a tool that you can pull upon, and again, it feels overpowered in some sense. Where like you roll a fail on your dice, but then you just cancel it out completely. But I don't know. It was very awkward. I think sort of having to come up with creative uses for it every time, and then but also I was just constantly not having enough stress to spend, like because again we hadn't had downtime, so we'd very quickly capped ourselves out and weren't able to pull on those tools to the full effect, I think. It's coming up with creative ways of implementing that was just a bit of another struggle for me in terms of thinking of things on the fly to incorporate.
I do want to say, as we're kind of talking through the nitty-gritty of the action roll and the resistance roll, John Harper just released a supplement to Blades in the Dark called Blades Deep Cuts. I haven't read any of the setting stuff because, as we've established, I don't really care about the Blades in the Dark setting. But there's some cool mechanical stuff in there, and one of them, I think the most radical change in that supplement, does away with the action roll entirely, and it replaces it with something called the threat roll, where it's I won't describe it all. I can't even pull it off the top of my head. I've only read it once, but it I think it's his attempt to address this problem, right? Where it's like you do it less often. The game becomes more liberal about like, you're a skilled person at this, you just do it, and then when you do it, it puts some of this stuff we've been talking about on the front end kind of onto the back end. It seems very smart. I haven't implemented it with my players yet, but I'm going to try because it seems very cool.
Nice. Yeah, that does sound promising. All right. I think we've talked at a pretty good length here, so maybe we want to wrap it down a little bit. But I feel like we've covered a good ground for this game. I feel like we went a little negative there at the end. Just not bad. We're allowed to express that.
I'm very positive on this game, despite all the negative things that we've been saying and I've been saying. Like, I'm having a great time. I would if you have the like wherewithal to handle this kind of crunchy stuff we've been talking about, which I feel like any player of moderately complicated board games could handle this.
For sure.
Try it, because I am having a great time.
Yeah, I mean, I had a relatively negative time, but it's really hard to zero in on how much of that is the game. How much, not to say the GM is at fault here, they're in the room. Or how much
you're not being the
GM. What I could bring to this, and just sort of navigating the expectations, and again, very, very gritty, granular mechanics with fiction forward, and synthesizing those was tricky. It was a big learning experience, I think, especially with new players, with people we didn't know, and sort of getting group dynamics. I mean, something I've always struggled with in role playing games is, why are these players together? Why like these people clearly hate each other? Why are they still hanging out? What is the core motivation that's keeping them together and moving towards this common goal? And I don't think we'd quite navigated that, which was causing some friction. Yeah. So again, I don't think this game is necessarily for me. I think we could definitely get to a point where it's a lot more fun and engaging with some of those like the faction systems more often if we found the tempo. But it does take some practice. It does requires a lot of careful molding to sort of push through the filler, get to the action, and navigate those fiction points.
Yeah, building on that, I do take a decent amount of the blame for any of the roughness that occurred during our particular game. But to build on that, to your point, Daniel, I think it's true. It's really about the group. It's like the group has to really be on the same page about approach, feel, what's fair, and they also have to carry their own load. They have to carry their own part of the storytelling and the kind of the rules enforcement. I think the group has to be cohesive, or else the whole enterprise is going to fail, I think. And I think that was part of the downside of our experiences. But your mileage may vary. If you are an experienced group, or even if you're equally unexperienced with TTRPGs, you might really flourish under the gameplay systems that a Forged in the Dark game can offer. So there's good and the bad. And my main criticism, on top of the smaller criticisms I've already laid, also clocks. Man, so many clocks upon clocks. That could be a whole diatribe. But my main criticism of this game book, probably Scum and Villainy specifically, is that it could have been a whole lot shorter. Like, I kind of wish it was narrower. I feel like the things that are unique about it, like the setting, the factions, the system descriptions, even like the playbooks, for the most part, there was some roughness there. Definitely the ship types; those are all great. I love those to bits, and I feel like they were just right. Not too much lore that you feel like buried under it. Thankfully, it's not set in a licensed world like Star Wars or like Star Trek or Alien, where you feel like that's a whole yoke resting on your shoulders. Like, you have the freedom to sort of mold this game into a sci-fi that works for you in your group. But I felt like there's a whole lot of contradictory descriptions of rules and recommendations. Something like 12 pages and like 40 different types of GM advice. And a lot of them are either going to be hard to remember or they literally contradict some
Speak
of
to
the
your
rules.
players, but also speak to your characters.
Yes.
Which is like cute, right? It's like, okay, I get like, yes, they're saying sort of like, okay, both of these things can work. But yes, I agree. This is not an easy, either you're new to role playing and so you need some hand holding, or you played a lot of D&D style games and this is going to be very different. And the book, it doesn't make it the easiest.
I found the book a little overwhelming, and just the layout feels very technical manual. It's not very good at pulling out. It's,
oh my gosh.
It's very little there to sort of help memorize. Like there's no color, like literally no color. There's very few images to give much evocative sense of the flavor of this universe. Or just there's a couple of tables, but even those are very sort of gray and just don't really help you memorize and stick those mechanics into your mind. So again, I think those short guides, the sort of printout guides, Mark, that you showed earlier, I think those do a better job of this layout to help internalize those rules more than anything in the actual rule book.
Right. Like I mentioned earlier, what I wish this game did was it took an approach from another game that's Forged in the Dark based. I'm holding up my copy of Cyberpunk CBR plus PNK, which is a literal Forged in the Dark game, but it can be played with just this one-page pamphlet.
Awesome.
And so what it does is it really distills the heart of Forged in the Dark games down to a really small package, and it adds these supplements which are on these individual separate pamphlets. So it's sort of like a scaffold where you can add on and build on and kind of choose for yourself what subset of options I want to engage with. And I feel like if the most of the material in this book were sort of delivered in a more like focused package, that I would have found more success in it, and maybe you can build the game in a way that really works for your group.
So I had one final question here. So I might be this might be something of an insult considering the audience here. Do you think this game could be tweaked into a GM-less system? Not to undersell the role of the GMs in this game, but considering how much of the collaborative fiction involved, it does feel like it could be tweaked in that direction, where everyone's just collaboratively agreeing on the cause and effect of like those
Greg, you go first because I have a very specific answer.
I do not have time to design another game. My plate is full, but this is a great idea, and we should totally do it. I think especially like thinking about sort of like the board game RPG space I've been working in, I would love to make some sort of mechanical system to control faction, alliance, and sentiment. And then all the players can just consult the Oracle and say, oh, well, obviously the Bounty Hunters Alliance comes after us now, right? Like, yeah, I want to do it.
Just roll the tables.
That sounds really cool, Greg, but I think that you should first start by checking out this particular product that already exists. It's called Ironsworn Starforged, which is itself a spin-off of Ironsworn. So this is a GM-less or guided or co-op or solo sci-fi based game that works off of tables and encourages you to build out your own world, your own lore, your own setting, and can be played entirely GM-less. So if some of that sounds interesting to our listeners,
all my Christmas money before Christmas even happens.
Oh, come on. You want to spend it anyway.
I do. This looks awesome.
Yeah. So it sounds like we should talk about this sort of thing more. Maybe next year we'll have a follow-up. We'll talk about Ironsworn Starforged. So many of the cool Forged in the Dark based games that are out there. Awesome. How do we all feel?
Yeah, I think we're ready to bring this home. I am looking forward to playing more TTRPGs in the new year. Our last sort of feature review was Fallout, which was last year, and we told ourselves we were going to try and do one a year. And we're barely scraping through, rolling under the door as it's coming down at the last moment. With one this year, so hopefully we'll be back with more soon. I did have a great time with this, but as much as I think that we could mold this and train ourselves to be better at this game, there's a lot of other games out there that I'm keen to try as well.
Yeah, mostly agreed. I would keep playing this, but I would want to give it a shot as a player. Maybe let someone else GM it and see how they try it out and learn from their abilities. How about you, Greg?
I only ever want to GM this game. I thought about it. Both of my players are very like, yeah, we'll hop in and GM when we need to, but like, I like GMing it. It's a lot of fun.
Excellent.
Very cool. So there's a lot of solid stuff to recommend here. So I do recommend checking it out to anyone that's even somewhat interested. There's a lot of good meat on these bones. Okay, so we've talked at length, and on that note, it's almost the end of the year. This episode's probably going to drop around Christmas time. So
happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Yes.
Hope everyone gets a fun chance to play a bunch of games on their downtime if you get it. And Greg, hey, tell us more about your upcoming projects or anything you want to shout out, make the world or our listeners know about.
Well, I'm making a GM list. No, just kidding. I'm not. I'm the big thing I'm plugging here is I've already talked about at the top is Keep the Faith, which is a storytelling game sort of at the intersection of RPGs and board games. So if you're an RPG curious board gamer, you're like the target audience, right? This is like for you. It's about a religion in transition. You'll tell little stories about, our priest's garments look like this, and that's because we believe this. And then 100 years later, somebody's like, well, actually, I got to play a session at PAX Unplugged with some friends, and my friend T.L. Simons created a sect where all the priests wore Carhartt workwear to represent their allegiance to the laborers and the underclass and the oppressed. They ended up ruling the faith 500 years later. So that kind of thing happens in this game. It's coming to backer kit from Central Michigan University Press at the end of January.
Very exciting. I'll drop the link in the show notes.
Thank you.
Sounds so cool. Well, I want to thank you again, Greg, for taking time out of your holiday season and your busy time as a parent to talk shop with us. But
I loved it. I had a great time.
Yeah, great conversation. I wish we could talk more about it, but
for sure,
sometime in the future. All right, Daniel, you want to lead us out?
Yeah, well, if you have any questions or comments on this episode or any other games you've been playing over the holidays, perhaps, you can contact us at omnigamersclub@gmail.com or at our website, omnigamers.club.
Great. And check us out on YouTube, or we'll share our videos there as well. Leave comments, share episodes with someone in your life who might be interested in all manner of games that we cover. I want to thank Greg Loring-Albright again for joining us on the show, and a happy
Thanks
holidays.
For having me.
Oh, of course, anytime. come on again.
I would love to.
So cool. Yeah, we'll definitely talk about more games because you're an Omni gamer too.
Shall we announce our next episode?
Oh yeah, we do keep making these things. All right, sure.
Well, new year, new game. So let's see. What are we playing? We are playing Slay the Spire, the board game. Of course, we'll also be talking about the digital game, which is, of course, inspired by card games originally. So the circle is complete. So we'll be talking all things spires and slaying them. So that will be in the new year. We may have some game of the year things to discuss. I don't know. We haven't figured out a format for that yet, but we'll wing it.
Very cool. All right. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy holidays. Everyone out there, have a balanced diet of holiday gaming.
Bye.
Bye.